Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon, and I'm your host today. I'm your host every day and of every episode of Pod Save Chocolate. And before we jump into today's topic, which is going to be further exploration of the interrelationships between the EUDR, the CSDDD, the CSRD, and the ESRS, I'm going to take a quick moment to let everybody know that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported by members of The Chocolate Life. And so if you go over to The Chocolate Life right now, this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life Live. You can see what it is that's going on. And if you're not currently a member, you can support what it is that we're doing here by clicking on the green button over at the top. I'm logged in, so mine says account. If you're not logged in, you will say join. Join, become a member. And support what it is that you're doing. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give a thumbs up, like, subscribe to the video and the channel, and support the work that we're doing here. So for this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, I create a post on The Chocolate Life. And so here is the post for today's episode. This is the archive of the links, and it's resources that you can go to find out more information, things that are mentioned during the course of the episode. And I chose the particular image for this episode. It's sort of, it's a tree, obviously, but it's sort of out of focus and blurry and moving around. And that's sort of metaphor for me of what the EUDR especially is at the moment. And one of the challenges associated with doing many of the things that we do here when we try to predict the news is that between the time my interview with Marc Donaldson and the majority of the rest of the hour is going to be playing back an interview that I did with Mr. Donaldson the day before Thanksgiving last year. I was traveling, he was traveling. I had a chance to sit down and talk with him. And we were talking about whether or not the EUDR would be delayed. And Mark's opinion at the time was the likelihood of it was less likely to be delayed than more likely to be delayed. But we did learn earlier this week that the deadline for the final implementation of the EUDR has been pushed off from December 31, 2024 to December 31, 2025. I left that part of the interview in because I think there's an interesting discussion around it. But we talk about the EUDR, and then specifically there are questions having to do with who is likely to be inspected, whose responsibilities are it, what are the risks associated with being out of compliance and things like that. And so that is what the majority of this episode is all about. And so I hope that you will stay through and watch through to the end of the interview. I found it to be interesting, but of course I was in the middle of the interview. I'm doing the interview. But as with everything, go into the comments. Let me know where in the world you're connecting from. And if you do have questions about anything that I mentioned or that Mark is mentioning during the recorded interview, what I can do is I can stop the interview. I can stop the video, get your question up on screen, and I can clarify. So I can do that in real time. So if you'd like to, in the comments, just ask your questions. I'm sitting here listening to everything. I'm watching the comments, and I will be able to get your comments and questions up on the screen during the course of the episode. Again, what I will do is I can stop the video at any time. And with that, I think what I'm going to do is I am just going to begin with the interview with Marc Donaldson, who's a colleague of mine. He's been on episodes of The Chocolate Life Live and Pod Save Chocolate in the past. And he is, well, I'll let Mark and I'll let the interview stand for itself on this particular case. And so I was in the airport in Phoenix getting ready to board a plane to Chicago for the inaugural Midwest Craft Chocolate Festival when I received a call from you, Mark, and you said, "Hey, Clay, I want to talk to you about some things, right, that you may not have known about, and need to go into a little more detail when it comes into this." So the first thing I want to do is there has been a move to delay the implementation of the EUDR. And so as someone who's you were at the Cocoa Association of Asia, you're doing work as an independent in Europe at the moment, but have, I would say, back channels into what's going on in the Brussels legislature. What are your thoughts? Will the EUDR be delayed in terms of its implementation, and why do you think that way?
Okay, so in fact, I mean, the story is an ever-moving one, and you know, there are behind-the-scenes meetings to try and resolve an impasse between the people who are introducing the extra components to the legislation.
Could you go over and let us know what those extra components are?
Right. Well, the thing to remember, or I didn't know until I got involved in all of this, is that the European regulations make very clear with if you're talking about a new regulation, once it's gone into law, which the EUDR is already in law, okay, it's just not actually being applied yet. If you want to change that, then anybody can change anything or apply to change anything they want, right? So when the Commission put forward a proposal to delay by a year, once that proposal to delay goes forward, it means that any of the other 28 countries or whatever can propose anything they like as a change to the regulation. So what the Commissioner Ursula said was, if anyone tries to add anything else to the regulation, except the delay, then we will pull the idea of a delay in the first place. But of course, if your parents, when you're a teenager, tell you not to do something, then I'm sorry, you go and do it, don't you? So this particular political party waited until the very last minute and then proposed, I think it was 7 different things. Okay. A lot of them are quite spurious and almost impossible to add in there. But there's one that is very specific and aimed purely at nest protection in Europe, okay, which is that the regulation tries to or has a level of risk of different countries, right, for cocoa which isn't from non-deforested areas. And this has been the first big argument because it basically is more friendly to Africa than it is to, say, South America or Asia. And there was a lot of hoo-ha from the Indonesian government, the Ecuadorian government, saying this isn't fair because why should we have a higher risk than, say, Africa? But this new proposal proposes that there should be 3 zero-risk countries, okay? And this isn't necessarily to do with cocoa, because obviously there isn't any cocoa grown in Europe. This is to do with timber, right? Where, as you know, Clay, it also covers timber. And very briefly, there is a lot of timber coming from outside Europe into Europe. A lot of it comes from China as pulp, and a lot of it goes into Germany. And you can't, for love nor money, it's very, very dangerous to do any kind of GPS tracking in China. You're likely to get shot. Mm-hmm. So there's a big problem in getting this supply from elsewhere, and the German timber farmers have not been prepared or ready for this. And so amongst other countries, there's a lot of proposals to try and feather the nests in Europe and say, now it's zero risk in Europe. And of course, you can imagine there are two sides of the 2 big sides, right? And at the moment, both sides are refusing to kind of even talk about it because they both want to take it to the brink. The problem is that there was a meeting delayed last week, which was meant to happen about this, which hasn't happened. The next meeting that possibly can happen is the 16th of December, right? Which means we get very close to the end of the year. And if it is still unresolved, on the 31st of December, and remember, you've got Christmas and holidays in the way, then the regulation will come in by default, right? Because it's not being legally changed. And that's where we are today, right? And there's a lot of side meetings behind the scenes. Really and truly, we've gone into the area of pure politics now. This has got nothing to do with deforestation or the protection of a single tree anywhere. It's got to do with, well, if you do this, I could do this for you in the future, and I'll scratch your back, and then maybe you could do this. And so it's just politics. And so it's a very difficult situation to predict exactly what will happen now.
Right. But I get the sense from what you're saying that if the meeting on the 16th doesn't happen, or for any reason, if the meeting on the 16th doesn't happen, then the likelihood of there being any delay is essentially zero. And if the meeting on the 16th does happen, and what they do is they open it up for the delay, it then is up to the commissioners to decide, are they going to, by law, I think they have to open up the conversation to all of these other amendments to the legislation.
They certainly have to open up the conversation to everybody. And what's more, even if they agree to do it by the 16th, it still has to be translated into 28 languages and signed by 28 sets of people, right? Which is not the work of a moment over Christmas. Okay.
Right.
So
yes. So, all right. So, I mean, so I get this. If this were the betting markets, what we do is say that it's an odds-on favorite that it will not be delayed. And I think part of it is also that there are a lot of companies who've spent a lot of time and money over the last year or so, and there's probably EUDR compliant cocoa on the water right now, right? And so, I'm sorry.
There's a lot of EUDR compliant cocoa already in Europe, right? Okay, because at the end of the day, no one wanted to be caught out, and you still have to make product. You know, for now is a really busy time in all chocolate and cocoa manufacture. And you know, maybe, I don't know, 300,000 tons could be of either already delivered cocoa or cocoa, you know, on the water. That's EUDR compliant. I mean, you think about it, the EU uses 1.5 million tons of cocoa a year. Just turn that into quarters, and you can pretty much work out how much needs to be.
Well, that's
around
20% of that's 20% of the annual consumption.
Exactly.
So it's
that's right.
Yeah, and so that's the first major question. So people are saying, okay, you know, do we need to worry about being EUDR compliant at the end of 2024, or will this be phased in over 2025? And you should plan for the legislation to come into effect on December 31st, 2024. Just do it. So the other thing that you talked about to me, which I thought was really, really interesting, because I said, okay, you know, the cocoa is going to be inspected at the port of entry. And you said that's not the way it works. So can you tell me, you know, how the inspection regimen works, right? Where the inspection will happen.
Right.
And then you made some interesting comments about, you know, if you are inspected, what are the likelihood of being re-inspected? And then who is likely to not be subject to inspection? Because I think that's a big thing. So, and then we can talk about who is ultimately liable if you fail the inspection.
Yep. So first thing is, it's a law. Okay. So in theory, if you're a European company, you are legally obliged to apply to comply with the law. End of story. Okay. But in exactly the same way as if you're a driving license holder, that you're legally complied to keep to the speed limit. You know, if the police don't check in your little village, then probably everyone's speeding, right? Nothing ever happens about it. The main thing to have at the top of your mind is that the legislation allows you to go 5 years backwards, right? So at the end of the day, if it comes in on the 1st of January in 2025, it means that they have up to the end of 2030, and they can still go backwards 5 years and check, right? So this is something to be aware of. And the ultimate penalty is absolutely horrific. So it's 3% of your European turnover. So if you imagine someone like, Barry Callebaut, 3% of the European turnover is going to be absolutely stratospheric. So they will, obviously be complying. As you said, there are many large companies, and everything from certainly in Europe, everything from all the supermarkets. Okay, so you take all the American supermarkets, Walmart, for instance, who've got a lot of interest in Europe. They are already ready to comply. Their suppliers, let's say the FMCG companies, the brands, they're all ready to comply. Their suppliers are already ready to comply. So, the space rocket has got everyone on board. The gantry's pulled away, and we're just waiting for someone to press the button. And to delay the launch
if you can, so I am delaying the launch is not where I want to talk about right now, because we said, maybe it's going to happen, but probably it's not. But if the inspection isn't happening at the port of entry by customs officers,
correct,
where is the inspection happening?
Okay, so the law is to be applied by the lovingly acronym of NAC, National Authorities of Competence. So those of you who have ever worked with a National Authority of Competence, please put your hands up. And no one's got their hands up, right?
Yeah.
And in Europe, these are probably as under-resourced as they are anywhere else in the world. But they're the local authorities, they're national authorities that are involved in EEU, right? And the thing is that because you need, in order to check this compliance, the risk or the provenance falls on the importing company, right? In other words, the law says the last operator to put the product on the market in Europe. Okay, right? So that means that it is, for instance, if you take a company who is processing cocoa and putting it onto the market in Europe, say in cocoa butter or cocoa liquor or cocoa powder or chocolate, then they are the person that the law applies to, right? And what they have to do is they will be getting from their cocoa bean supplier something called a DDS, which is a due diligence statement that is going to be available in a soft form, in electronic format, and that holds all the GPS data, right, and the polygon data as to where this product has come from, right. And that can be then uploaded onto the EU system, and then they, from their satellite tracking maps, they can decide whether it's in or out. Okay, this is enormously complicated. No one had ever considered. The EU had never considered many things, but one of the things they had never considered was how small the areas that these farmers farm are. So, for instance, to give you a very brief idea, in one container of cocoa beans, there could quite easily be 50,000 GPS points, right? So you can imagine that in a million, in a million tons, 1.5 million tons coming into Europe, this is billions of GPS points. And early days, and even now, trying to test the system keeps on falling over because it just can't deal with the amount of data, right? But as I say, the responsibility falls on the companies who are putting those products into market. And so at the end of the day, it's impossible for customs, as in the port of entry, to be able to check this, right? It's not something that they can do. So basically, if you're a company outside of Europe and you get an order for cocoa or chocolate or any products like that, then it is the responsibility of your customer to ask you for the documentation and a due diligence certificate, right? And if they then import that product without a due diligence certificate, it's their responsibility and not yours, right? They have to be in control of whether the documentation is right or wrong. It is their due diligence and not yours, right? And then the other side of the law, which is what I was trying to explain to you, which is, you know, a Pareto curve is 80-20. It means that 80% of everything is done by 20% of whatever, basically. And so the European law deals with that in a very simple way. It says to the National Authority of Competence, you have to identify the top 9% of companies in your country that are putting these products onto the market. And then you take the top 9% of that 9%, and those are the companies that you have to audit in the first year. Okay. So this is going to be a fairly limited amount of people, right? You're doing the maths.
Yeah, it's less than 1 in 100 companies who are involved in the. So
that's right.
Yeah, it's like it is like 0.81% or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just start off with, right? And so if you then think about that in real terms, it means that only the major importers of either cocoa or chocolate derivatives or ingredients are going to really be checked in the first instance. However, should they become knocking at your door, in 5 years' time, they can go backwards, and they can go to the 1st of January 2025 and say, demonstrate to us that you were compliant then, right? But I think this is, you know, from a risk assessment point of view, you know, and I think even if they do, in fact, to a certain extent, it could be better that they start on the 1st of January this year, because everybody knows that they will be very soft in the way they approach this, whilst in a year's time, they could take an entirely different opinion. And on top of that, the only other way that the EU can be persuaded to do an audit on someone, if there is a complaint against that company, right, as to the viability of their chocolate and cocoa. And I believe that companies who are, you know, very much based on like Greenpeace, etc., right, they are already getting together and say, right, let's get ourselves together so that the 1st of January 26, we already have a load of companies that we will write to the EU and complain about. So to a certain extent, it could be worse if we delay it, right?
Right.
I think that it's a very, very complex piece of legislation. There are still a number of areas that we don't understand how it's going to apply or what they're looking for. Things like, you know, the fact you've got to demonstrate that you have carried out due diligence and checking on all of this. I mean, it's almost impossible. So, I mean, you explained it extremely well, and that's why I rang you up. And to be honest, you know, the alphabet soup of all of this is, and all of them are one. They're all linked to all these new legislations, but they are also going to be. There's a UK version in a year's time or 18 months' time, which is less onerous, and it really focuses on big companies. There's an American version that's going to come in about 2 years' time, I believe. There's a Japanese version that's going to come in about the same time. So we're going to have this in our thing of life to do, the regulations to do anyway, right? Whether we like it or not. It will be beautiful to believe there will be a global system, but I very much doubt that will happen, because it's kind of a trade war thing as well. You know, I'm sure the Americans consider this to be a trade embargo on American products. I can't believe anything else, right? Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question, but because we have a new administration that is retrogressive when it comes to, just to put it mildly, when it comes to international trade, and so they will likely seize upon it, as a drum to beat upon. But let's I want to ask a couple of questions here, which I think are important. But before I do that, I want to highlight something to say, is if you are a small chocolate maker and you are exporting to Europe, right, then, and you are exporting to like a small distributor. So I'm thinking of High Five in the Netherlands or Stauco or somebody like that. The chances of you're ever being audited are next to zero.
I think the chances of them being audited.
Well, those importers.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Next to zero,
yeah.
Right. However,
I think it's.
You do need to, if asked, you do need to be prepared to provide the documentation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So
how do you get this? How do you get this documentation? Well, this is where
you need to ask your suppliers. You need to ask your suppliers. I mean, and you need to trust it. But importantly, from a legal and risk perspective, and so this is a question that I asked. So if I am in the United States and I am buying cocoa beans from Ecuador, and my Ecuadorian supplier supplies me with this this diligence certificate, so this DDS. Right. What I will do is I will keep a copy of it. And I have to keep a copy of it for 5 years. Not so bad. I have to keep tax records in the United States for 7. So, and these are electronic, so they're not going to take up any space. And if asked, I can turn them around. But in the end, what happens is it is not my response. It is never going to be my responsibility to ensure the accuracy and the completeness of those things. It is going to be the importer in the EU that is going to be responsible for it. Is that correct?
So you need to do one other thing, right?
Okay.
You need to write an email or a letter to your supplier, asking them to confirm, right, that the ingredients they are supplying to you, whatever they are, the cocoa, chocolate, whatever, are in compliant with EUDR, okay? And it's good, I mean, in fact, I think everyone's going to have to do this anyway, to make sure that your supply chain statement, your internal supply chain statement as a company statement says that, you are complying with external regulations. I mean, that's more important inside Europe, but in terms of what you should do outside Europe is you should definitely your first due diligence, and that's something that really you have to do in any due diligence system, right? Is you have to ask your supplier the question, and you have to have an answer to that, right? Because then you kind of pass the buck, up the food chain.
Right. So we say is when we talk about the interrelatedness of the EUDR and the CSDDD. So the CSDDD has some very, very specific requirements on EU domiciled companies, right, to do specific things. So while as an American company, you may not need to comply with the letter of the CSDDD, you need to comply with the spirit of the CSDDD and have this framework in place.
But it's like saying, if the police stop you and, you're obviously very drunk and they say, do you know, sir, that, you can't drink and drive, and you say, no, I don't, then you're in big trouble because you don't even know the law, whether you're applying to it or not. So it's about respect to the law. That's the first thing that's I think in all of this is very important. The fact that you acknowledge that there is a law, and secondly, that you know what that law is. Now, whether you're in or out, that's another question. But the fact is that if you don't even know about the law, then that's a problem, right? And that's one of the biggest things in Europe, because people have just said, I don't really know about this. I'm sorry, that's not a defense. And due diligence is a very simple sort of way to get, shall I say, something, on the ground. Say, this is what it is. I've got this on my desk. I wrote to my supplier. I asked him the question. are you compliant with the EUDR? They said yes. They sent a letter back. That means you've done your due diligence, right? But to say I don't know anything about it, that doesn't work, right? Yeah.
So you've done due diligence in terms of the bare minimum that needs to be done to cover your
Hmm.
ass. We
Yeah.
say this is the way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
talk.
Well,
Yeah. So let's talk another thing. It's like, are do you think that the National Authority of Competence, whatever that agency is in the
mhm.
Netherlands, is speaking and sharing data information with the national authority in Italy? Are they? I mean, just picking those two
Right.
random countries,
This is
right?
no, it's a very good question, and we don't know the answer to that. Well, we do actually. We know that the Belgians and the Dutch, because that's where most of the cocoa comes into Europe, they're talking very closely to each other. Okay.
Mhm.
Everyone else, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, refuse to discuss it. They do not want to tell you what they're going to do or how they're going to do it. The French proposed, and this is just by the by, the French proposed in they wanted to have their own set of extra rules for this in France. They wanted to know where everything came from: milk,
Mhm.
sugar, the lot. They wanted to know where every single ingredient came from, to the sort of farm,
Right.
which is like madness, right? But I think they've dropped that one now. But the problem is that it's just like if you go into the customs in Atlanta, you know, they're likely to be different from the customs in New Orleans, right? In terms of the airport, for instance, you know what I mean?
Well, it's a big thing. So, for example, if you're bringing agricultural products, whether it's on the water or in your luggage,
Yeah,
right, into
yeah,
Miami or into
yeah,
Los Angeles, they're going to be much, or into Hawaii, they're going to be much stricter than if the point of
exactly.
end, if then
Yeah,
you're flying into
yeah,
Dallas, Fort Worth, or to Chicago,
yeah.
right? So
So it's everyone's interpretation of a set
right.
of regulations, which is very complex. And just remember that many of these national authorities of competence have never, ever dealt with anything like this before. And they've never been inside a cocoa factory, for
Right.
instance. Right.
Right. So what it says is, so again, what's going to happen is that these products, rather than be inspected at the port of entry, are going to be inspected at the factory after this risk assessment. So we're doing this electronic risk assessment. We
Hmm.
flag something. Oop, this is coming from deforested land. How the heck you know that? Like I'm pulling my cocoa from inside a national forest, which is protected lands, and I'm doing all the work inside protected lands, but I transport it to someplace that is not in protected lands and is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
deforested. And
Yeah.
how do you go and manage? So the whole thing is suspect from that point. But at some point, you might get to the point, well, I'm going to cherry pick where my point of inspection is, right? So I'm in a, so I could, so here's an interesting question. Switzerland's not actually a part of the EU, really, right?
No,
And
but it's part of Schengen.
right. So, you got Barry Callebaut, which is domiciled from a corporate perspective in Switzerland, but the biggest factory in the world is in Belgium, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing that, Callebaut, because of where they have all their processing plants, is saying it doesn't matter technically whether, we are an actual EU member state, right? In that sense, that we're going to comply.
Each Because I do business. I'm doing EUDR with a company in Europe, and each company uh, it's difficult because they have factories in three different countries in Europe, right? And so they will be dealt with by the local authority in their own sweet way. Yeah. Um,
So they're going
it's
to be
it's a good.
asked, theoretically, they're going to ask to be in compliance differently in each of the
Well,
member states,
maybe
theoretically.
if the national authority wants to read the regulation in a different way, yeah, absolutely. Because, for instance, if you say that taking organic cocoa into, I don't know, Italy is fairly easy, right?
Mhm.
But trying to get organic cocoa into, say, Spain is a lot more complicated. It's the same set of regulations, right? But different ways of looking at how your paperwork should be, yeah?
Mhm.
Because in each country, the word organic means a little bit different, right? And it's one of the problems we have generally with organic products, because there are three standards in the world and none of them will work with each other. So it makes it very difficult for people to be globally organic, because they've got to have certifications from three different organizations, none of which want to work together because they're all competing for money. Now, I mean, in exactly the same way as you said, yeah, you could pick where you want to bring your product in, and maybe you might bring it into through port Y, and then process it at factory X. But I think that's this is all going to come out in the wash.
Yeah.
EU have not thought about any of these problems in advance. Not one. There are many things that make no sense at all. Okay, and I'm sure it's going to be the same for paper. It's going to be the same for palm oil. You've got lecithin as well, but soy is there, but I don't think anyone's going to particularly worried about that. But you see, the one thing that should be in there, which isn't, is sugar, right?
And I had a conversation with Anthony Fountain about this, of Voice Network, when I did an interview about a year ago. And he says that's because all the land where sugar is grown was deforested prior to December 1st, or December 31st, 2020, or something, whenever that regulation. So there are a number of and that was, again, political horse trading that was being done. So we're not going to include we're not going to include sugar.
White chocolate, which has definitely got cocoa butter in it, that is not in the regulation. It's not in the regulation, right? It's what, and also it's, but something like cocoa shell is.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have to, in this factory I'm working with, we have to find, we have to trace all the cocoa shell. I mean, and doing this work in a cocoa factory is, I can tell you, it's a labor of madness, because there are many things in a cocoa factory that go round and round in circles. Yeah, there's lots of, you can't call it rework. It just comes out of one machine and goes into another machine and comes out of that machine. And sometimes it goes into another machine and sometimes it doesn't, right? Depending on what they're making, right? Because, processing cocoa is incredibly complex. And I really feel for cocoa processors outside the EU, who are bringing in, say, someone in the States might be bringing in product from Ecuador, might be bringing product from Indonesia, or even, West Africa. And, they're going to have due diligence for all of those three products. For anyone who blends cocoa to make a product, which most factories in Europe do. Most what I think most people don't realize is the essence of somebody's taste is the blend of cocoa they use. Whether you like that or not, whether you're a Hershey's fan or a Mondelez fan or a Mars fan or a Nestle fan, it doesn't really matter. But they're going to be using a blend of cocoa to make their house taste. And obviously, if they're using three different cocoas, which most people do, because it allows them to play around with the different flavors of each crop and make a consistent product, then you've got three times the problem. It's as simple as that. So, it's not something that it's not a regulation that's fit for purpose, but that's not the point. It's what we've got. Right.
Right. So before I wrap up, because what I want to do is I want to highlight in terms of what I think you told me, so that I understand it right. So for everybody who's listening to this, there's they can get a sense for it. But all of this data is going to be put into a repository, right, which is managed out of Brussels or managed by. Okay. So is the data in that repository going to be publicly available?
No.
What? So,
well, the problem is it would be, you see, the thing is that then you could work out that, you could work out in theory, and then all the big companies said, no way to this, right? Because in theory, you could look at where they would.
no. Hey, Mark.
Clay.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So in theory, you could look at
the data and work out exactly where company A the farmer or the farm that they were getting their cocoa from. Yeah.
Well, I'm saying, okay, let's sort of de-identify that component of it, right? But right now, for example, if you were to go to the government of Nigeria and say, how much cocoa do you produce? And you go to ICO and you ask them how much cocoa they produce, and you go to every other quote unquote competent authorities and you try to figure things out, what you do is you end up with very, very different numbers, right? And so, you know, what I would like to see is, okay, let's de-identify to the farm, right, to the individual plot level, but I'd like to be able to run, I would like to be able to train the machine learning data set, because ultimately I think that's where this is going, right? So the data are going to go into this big repository, and there's going to be a machine learning algorithm that picks things out, because there's just too much data for anything to a human to go and check it.
It's very true. But the Nigerians were planning to do this on pieces of paper, the whole EUDR thing. And it was pointed out to them that they would need to employ another 300 people to do it. And even then it would be just about impossible, right? So,
but if I look at the import regulations from something like the CSRD and the ESRS, there's a very, very specific XML standard which has to be used in order to report this data, and it has to be electronic. So at some point, what are they going to do? Provide paper to their buyers, and their buyers are responsible for transcribing it? I mean,
in the end, everything. I mean, you know, there are factories in Europe who weren't completely, shall I say, software based. Okay. And they've had to spend huge amounts of money on some kind of MRP system to get this into an electronic state, because it's physically impossible to do it any other way. And you know, for the guys who said to their customers, who said we only want one batch number, they're going to be surprised at what they get.
Right? No, totally. But let's before we wrap this up, and I want to do this. One of the things I think that people 2024 saw this just wild dislocation in the market. So all of a sudden, cocoa went up to historic highs, at least in constant dollar terms. I mean, it's whoops.
Yeah. Sorry, you're gone. Whoops. Sorry. There you go.
Yeah. So the price of cocoa went up in terms of constant dollar terms to the highest it's ever been. If you actually compare 12,500 US compared with the price in the 1980s, subject to inflation, it turns out those prices were higher. But the 12,500 really shocked people, primarily probably because of speculation based upon fueled by supply concerns. But we've been looking at the price, futures prices inch down to something that's more normal. But in the last couple of weeks, it's just exploded again, right? Do you I mean, is that because people were overly optimistic about the return to normal supply and it hasn't returned to normal, right? And so
that was but this is like if you go back to this time last year, right? No, not quite this time last year, but January of this year, when the market went up to 7, 8, whatever it was, right? And the thing is that a lot of people normally buy in first quarter. The first quarter of a year is one of the best times historically to buy cocoa or chocolate, right? And so people, and fourth quarter is always the worst time historically to do that, right? And so most people don't think about buying too much in fourth quarter, and they wait until first quarter. And so basically when the market went crazy from January onwards, people thought, what do I do, right? And my advice to anyone who rang me was, you sit down, you get yourself a glass of your favorite whiskey, a big glass, you drink it, and then you buy everything you can, right? And all right, that happened to be correct advice. I'm not markets can go up and down, but for me at the time there was no way out, right? And over the sort of summer months, there was a lot of DDD. It rained one day in Africa, the market went down. It was dry the next day, the market went up. This is like absolutely ridiculous. Reality is that we were long way behind the 8 ball last year, And this year I think the crop is going to be short. As you see, we're two positions, December and March, are now over 9,000, which I said would happen a month ago. The mid crop, I understand, is being quite heavily damaged by rain at the moment. Ghana is in a real mess. They don't have any money to pay the farmers. And I think a lot of people don't either have cocoa or they're hoarding cocoa. Anyway, the Ghana crop is not going to be good. So, at the end of the day, we're going to have a few more marbles in the playground than we did last year, but not that many. And 3 years of deficit we had, right? We're,
Mhm.
Even at the worst possible number, you could say, as in the best possible number, you're talking about 600,000 down. And when I heard people a month or 2 months ago talking about a surplus, I didn't even know what they were talking about or what planet they were on. Because, for sure, and you look at the beans coming out of Ivory Coast at the moment, they're all small beans, they're over 100 count. And in many cases, they're over the legal limit. But the CCC, the people in charge of the exports, they have to let them go because otherwise they're just not going to have the volume they said. And I mean, also, Ivory Coast said it was going to be 2.1 or 2.2 million tons. I think that's just wishful thinking, because they need to try and keep the prices down because just remember, at some point in time they've got to negotiate the mid crop with the farmers, and they might have to give them another 25% raise, which is great for the farmers. That as well as I do, because in I think one of the things that people don't understand is that in Ecuador and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and in Nigeria and Cameroon, all these farmers are getting, shall we say, three times the money that they're getting in Ivory Coast and Ghana, right?
Mhm.
And that the system is broken. The system was put in place to pay farmers a minimum amount for their cocoa.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, that same system has no methodology in it to deal with a high cocoa price.
Well, I think if I can, just political hobby horse and something that I talked about
Mm-hmm.
is that the
Mm-hmm.
situation we are in now was entirely predictable, right? If
Oh,
you go
absolutely.
through,
Mm-hmm.
4 or 5 decades of a
Mm-hmm.
pricing structure which says we're not going to invest at all in keeping the farms healthy and making them productive and all that kind of stuff. When you do run into weather dislocations and perhaps disease dislocations, that the results are disproportionately bad. So the fact that for the last more than 50 years, right, there has been, if not outright collusion, then an agreement among big producers and governments, big buyers and governments, to try to do everything they can to suppress the price to reduce ingredients costs, then
Mm-hmm.
what we're looking at right now is the direct result of that. But let's talk about another thing. So this related to that, because there is a cost to EUDR compliance, right? And people don't think about that. And to what extent is that cost baked into the price, the market price of cocoa? I mean, is it built in, or is this on top of things? How are people?
Okay.
So, because you mentioned a number of like $300 to $400 per ton just to be
Euro
compliant,
dollars.
and who
Yeah,
pays
that's
that?
right.
Who pays that? Yeah.
Well, I think that the way to say this is that every single contract that's been done, I don't know, over the past 6 months, has a statement saying in order to make this EUDR compliant, it will cost, a number, whether it's $300 or $400 a ton, is not definitive at the moment because of the contract then goes on to say depending on actual costs, right? Because until you've
Right.
done something, you don't know. Um, but it's something like that because there are three very specific costs. There's the cost of getting the data in the first place. Then there's a cost of uploading it onto the system, and then there's a cost of verifying it, right? And those are three quite significant costs. And then you've got the cost of actually doing all this in the first place, which I can tell you is, in terms of man hours and stuff, is horrific. Okay. Now, obviously, when we set out with those, that 300 or 400 seemed to be quite a lot of money. But when you consider the cost of cocoa today, it's slightly less as a percentage. Okay.
Right.
But that's being passed on to the users, right? The users of cocoa butter, cocoa liquor, cocoa powder, chocolate,
Right.
blah, blah,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I suppose they will be trying to pass that on to the
Well,
retailers.
they're going to, but the question is that differential, right? The
Mm-hmm.
premium for EUDR compliance, let's call it that, the premium to be EUDR compliant, because that's what it is.
Yeah.
That's reflected in the futures prices. So that's baked into those prices. Okay, so
no, not at all.
okay,
No,
that is the question that I was thinking about.
Like no. It's like, and I don't want anyone to think that EUDR has anything to do with certification, because it doesn't. Certification is a choice. EUDR is not a choice. Okay. But it has got an extra cost. And the thing that makes me cry is it's just an admin cost.
Yeah.
So, of the $500 million or whatever it is that will come from this premium, and not $1 is going to be going towards the livelihood of a tree in anywhere, right? So I am, it's typical government regulation. It could be the EU, it could be in America, it could be anywhere, right? Where the cost of regulating is massive, and the end result doesn't really achieve too much, because if you look at palm oil, it's already done the damage. Palm oil's deforested, it already happened. Same with cocoa. We're 20 years too late doing this, and we've done it in the wrong way, because at the end of the day, as you rightly said, what we're doing is identifying the trees. We're not identifying the cocoa that's coming. And what you alluded to earlier on, which is called side selling, it's absolutely blindingly obvious that you get a whole lot of cocoa farmers whose trees are in the wrong place. They will take those cocoa beans when they're ready and take them to a cocoa farm where the trees are in the right place, and then they'll just go into the supply chain. So, I mean,
in some respects, it's a licensed buying company having its direct supply chain, but if they have a demand which they can't meet out of the direct supply chain, they're going to go into an indirect supply chain. They'll get it somewhere else, and and that. How do you keep track of that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, Clay, thank you so much for the conversation.
It's really important, but Mark, we're at the end of the time that was allotted here. But what I want to do is be very, very specific. Number one, if you are a small chocolate maker in the United States, a craft chocolate maker in the United States, and what you're doing is you're selling a couple hundred kilos of bars a year to a European distributor, so somebody that's domiciled in the EU, then the chances of that small distributor ever being audited is relatively small. And
it's
so
minimal. Yeah.
Right, it's minimal. But and even if they do get audited, you as a company, there's not going to be any potential financial penalty associated with it. So again, from an insurance perspective, you probably do not need to take out extra insurance to cover the cost of auditing, right?
No.
What you do is you run the risk of that supplier no longer buying from you. So you don't have to worry about I'm not compliant. Can't sell into the EU. That's not what it is, right? So you just run the risk of, if you're ever caught, you're not going to pay the fine, but you run the risk of losing the business, I think is a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. But again, if you're a chocolate maker, because the EUDR does have a component which is talking about a palm oil, so it doesn't attach to a craft chocolate maker for the most part. But if you are using palm oil in a center, if you're doing a confection,
a filling,
right, or you're using a compound, then you do need to worry about the palm oil component. If you are using soy lecithin, you do need to understand where the soy is coming from. And if you're using paper in your packaging, you do need to understand where the pulp is coming from. So when it comes to doing the necessary due diligence, and this is, I think, a point that I want to make, is that even if you're not going to be legally responsible for any of this in terms of risk of financial penalties, right, that you are going to want to do the due diligence to your suppliers, are you EDR compliant? Yes or no, right? You're going to want to make sure that you get those responses, right? So that you can have them on file, and that somewhere in your articles of incorporation, if you're in the United States, that might be the place to put them as an appendix to them that says, here's our corporate sustainability due diligence policy, right? We have a responsibility as a company to go ask our suppliers, are they compliant? Yes or no, right? We have a responsibility to turn over that information if we're ever asked for it, right? So I would, and that seems to me, again, talk to your lawyer about the best place to go, the best way to go implement it in terms of the way your business is structured. It may be different for a C Corp, which is going to have a board of directors and has got a whole different kind of compliance issue than if you're a closely held LLC, which is why I want to, which is why I want to make that point. So it's just, and it may make sense to be able to just assign some employee another title, which is compliance director, right? And that person, here's a point of contact for compliance, right? Even if you're a single person company, to do that, and have an email address that says.
But that in many countries' accounting things, you have to have someone who's compliance director now. Whether it's about personal information or all these things, it's they ask this.
Well,
right.
which does say that there's an interesting way to think about this, which is to think about compliance reporting like this as a function of producing your tax return, right? And your accountant is responsible for signing off on the statement. I mean, I think it's a good way to do it, because one of the things it says, if I have 500 small chocolate companies, none of them are going to share the same accountant. And so it's not possible. It's not possible to, find like in a certification program, you can find one company, one person who's on the take, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm not saying it does happen, but there is that point of failure possibility.
Right.
So that's when I think about some of the representation, some of the questions that I asked, right, in my original episode, those are where I want to. This is where I think, for the most part, the value of this is going to be. This conversation is understanding who is at risk and where the risk lies and where are the potential penalties associated with this, right? And if you're a small chocolate maker, and you're exporting relatively small quantities into an EU member state, then the issues that face you, all right, are very, very different from if you are a large manufacturer who is exporting to a very large company in the EU that's in that top 10, not top 9. Why did they choose 9% rather than 10% to make the math easy, right? But in that top percent of big companies. So if you're a supplier to Barry Callebaut, you're a supplier to ECAM, you are a supplier to Cargill, you are a supplier to, I don't know, does Olam have they have a manufacturing plant in Europe? I don't know that they do, but you get the idea that you can judge the risk based on that. But if you're selling to Mondelez and Mondelez is selling, if you're selling to Mars and Mondelez is selling, if you're selling to Meiji and Meiji is selling in Europe, these are like some of the top 5 makers in the world. Or you're selling into Aldi, or you're selling into Carrefour, or you're selling into those places, then there is a greater likelihood that you're going to come under scrutiny. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah,
absolutely. Right.
Anyway.
And Marc, this has been really, really great. What I'd like to ask you, I'm going to see if what we can do is we can put together some sort of private webinar where people can subscribe and ask specific questions. And if that interests you, right. Because this may not answer all the questions that everybody have.
No, I don't think it does. And a lot of the questions that the industry has haven't been answered yet. I mean, the EU has been very poor at doing that, but I mean that's because the number of questions has been incredible, right?
Yeah.
And we're just going to have to get going. I think that's the most important thing, is to get going and see where we go. I think, and they also probably believe that. Anyway, let's see
before we go, two very important lessons, right. Which is, when you start out, you don't know what you don't know.
No.
And there's a lot of stuff here, which is, we have well-intentioned regulators who've never set foot on a cocoa farm, And so they
Yeah.
don't know what they don't know.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right.
And treating the regime in Ghana the same way they're treating the regime in Nigeria.
Ivory Coast. Yeah.
And those are completely different things. And then the other part of it is there is a law of unintended consequences. Right. And so we're dealing with both this, I don't know what I don't know, and therefore the unintended consequences of the legislation become just magnified in huge ways. Right. And with that, Marc, again, thank you very, very much for joining me here today. And that was my interview with Marc Donaldson. And what I want to go is say thank you to Marc again. It's been really, really great. I want to thank everybody who's listened through to the end, like, subscribe. If you're not a member of The Chocolate Life, you can go over there and click on the green button. This is the post for today's episode. And this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is in fact supported by the members of The Chocolate Life. So if you like what it is that I'm doing, I would appreciate you going over to The Chocolate Life and becoming a member. There are sponsor tiers, so there are premium tiers. If you do have the resources to be able to support the work I'm doing, I don't do Patreon. I'm not doing, I'm not doing any YouTube advertising or anything like that. We can support what it is that we're doing directly on The Chocolate Life. And with that, I want to end up with 2 notes before I sign off. One of which is if you were a pre-order, if you did a pre-order of the Pyramid Tasting Handbook, this coming Sunday, the 8th of December, is going to be the launch party. And so I'm going to be hosting a private Google Meet. You'll be able to come in and I will be demonstrating how the pyramid tasting method works. And we'll also be going and answering all your questions. And it's going to be fun. And I'm going to be doing it with chocolate. And I don't need to have the same chocolate that you do because we're going to be using very different, because it's the method that matters, not the specific chocolates that we're using. So I do want to mention that. I also want to mention that this coming Tuesday is going to be a December sort of tasting gifting guide. So I'm going to be doing some tasting, finishing up my tasting of chocolates from the Midwest Craft Chocolate Festival. I'm going to be tasting a couple other things. I've got a post. There are going to be some sort of holiday gifting recommendations. I got a bit of hardware that I bought that I've been playing with, and I'll give you an idea about what I think about this specific bit of hardware and the class of hardware that we're going on. And then also at the same time, we're going to be doing the monthly member newsletter. It's going out early next week as well. So lots of stuff going on here at The Chocolate Life that I'm just letting you know about it. With that, I want to say, as I do at the end of every episode, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everyone, ciao.